October 2002. In the high-stakes world of Silicon Valley, a massive acquisition had just closed. eBay purchased PayPal for $1.5 billion in stock. While most of the founding team was busy celebrating their newfound generational wealth, one 31-year-old man was walking away under very different circumstances. Just a year earlier, while he was on a long flight to Australia for a fundraising trip, his own board of directors executed a silent coup, stripping him of his CEO title. Now, with the deal finalized, he found himself sitting on roughly $180 million in cash after taxes, unemployed, legally unattached, and entirely untethered from corporate oversight. In the early 2000s, standard Silicon Valley playbook dictated that you take that cash, throw it into a low-risk index fund, buy a venture firm on Sand Hill Road, or reinvest in safe, scalable software applications with 90% gross margins. Instead, this man sat down with a legal pad and began calculating whether he should dump his entire liquid net worth into two industries that every seasoned economist, investment banker, and veteran engineer explicitly warned him were financial suicide: commercial rocketry and mass-market electric vehicles. This video is not a fan-made tribute to Elon Musk. It is not an ode to the cult of personality or the myth of the lone genius. Rather, this video is an investigation into a systemic question: what was broken in the structure of American industry, politics, and culture in the year 2002, to the point where a person with that specific, borderline reckless risk tolerance had to exist? To understand why 2002 was the precise inflection point, we have to stop looking at the individual and start looking at the macroeconomic void left behind by American institutions. By the turn of the millennium, three massive pillars of American innovation had suffered structural collapse simultaneously. The first void was in aerospace. When the Berlin Wall fell and the Soviet Union collapsed, the space race lost its primary geopolitical catalyst. For 30 years, Congress funded NASA not out of pure scientific curiosity, but because space dominance was a vital proxy war for military supremacy. Once the geopolitical threat evaporated, space exploration transformed from a national security mandate into a discretionary budget line item. As a result, NASA's budget as a percentage of the federal budget plummeted steadily. But the problem wasn't just shrinking capital, it was structural stagnation. The federal government relied almost exclusively on legacy defense contractors like Boeing and Lockheed Martin through what is known as cost-plus contracting. Under a cost-plus contract, the government guarantees to cover every single dollar a company spends on research and development, plus a fixed percentage of profit. Think about the economic incentives created by that model. If a contractor finishes a rocket faster and under budget, they actually make less money. If they delay the project by 5 years and run over budget by billions, their profit margin increases proportionally. The system was fundamentally engineered to incentivize inefficiency. When NASA officially canceled the $1.2 billion X-33 spaceplane initiative in 2001, followed shortly by the tragic Columbia Space Shuttle disaster in early 2003, the message was clear. American human spaceflight was completely stalled, technologically stagnant, and prohibitively expensive. The second void was in energy and automotive manufacturing. By 2002, the American auto industry was deeply addicted to high-margin, gas-guzzling SUVs. Global oil prices were beginning an unprecedented decade-long climb, and geopolitical volatility in the Middle East was underscoring the extreme fragility of America's energy dependence. Yet Detroit refused to pivot. Just a few years earlier, General Motors had built the EV1, a surprisingly functional, all-electric vehicle. But in 2003, GM famously crushed its EV1 fleet in the desert, opting to shut down the program entirely. Why? Because an electric car threatened the entire aftermarket business model of traditional automotive dealerships. Gas-powered cars require constant maintenance, oil changes, spark plugs, transmission flushes, exhaust repairs. Electric cars, with a fraction of the moving parts, threatened the high-margin service departments that kept legacy dealerships profitable. This was a textbook execution of Clayton Christensen's Innovator's dilemma. Massive, profitable incumbents will actively kill superior, disruptive technologies simply because those technologies threaten their immediate, existing cash flows. Detroit didn't lack the engineering talent to build electric vehicles. They lacked the structural motivation. The third void was psychological and cultural. In March 2000, the dot-com bubble burst violently. Over the next 2 years, the Nasdaq index crashed by nearly 78%, wiping out trillions of dollars in paper wealth and driving hundreds of internet startups into bankruptcy. The 1990s had been an era of starry-eyed technological techno-optimism, a decade where people genuinely believed that the internet would solve every human problem overnight. When the crash hit, that optimism transformed into deep cultural cynicism. By 2002, mainstream venture capital had retreated completely into defensive, short-term plays. The public was tired of hearing about invisible algorithms, conceptual websites, and digital apps that possessed no physical assets and generated no actual profit. Society was experiencing a profound narrative deficit. People were hungry for physical, tangible technological progress that they could actually see, touch, and measure. It was at the exact nexus of these three structural voids that a unique financial event occurred. When eBay finalized its purchase of PayPal in late 2002, it generated dozens of newly minted millionaires, a group later dubbed the PayPal Mafia. But unlike his peers, who dispersed their capital into diversified portfolios, real estate, or software-focused venture funds, Elon Musk stepped out of that transaction with approximately $180 million in liquid cash and zero fiduciary duty to a corporate board of directors. This distinction is critical to understand from a venture capital perspective. If you are managing an institutional venture fund with money raised from pension funds, university endowments, and corporate investors, you are legally and ethically bound to maximize returns while managing risk. No institutional venture firm in the year 2002 would have ever authorized a $100 million investment into a private rocket company operating out of a rented warehouse in El Segundo, California, while simultaneously putting $70 million into an early-stage electric sports car concept. The probability of total capital loss on both ventures was calculated by industry analysts to be well over 90%. Therefore, the emergence of SpaceX in 2002 and Tesla shortly after in 2004 was not merely the result of individual ambition. It was the result of a specific formula. Three massive, stagnating industries suffering from severe innovation paralysis, combined with an individual possessing a massive lump sum of unconstrained personal capital, free from institutional oversight, operating in a culture desperate for a new physical technology narrative. This brings us to the core counterargument. Why didn't anyone else do it? After all, Silicon Valley in 2002 was filled with brilliant minds, seasoned executives, and individuals with far greater wealth and political connections. Why was this specific spot in history occupied by a South African-born internet entrepreneur with zero formal training in aerospace engineering or automotive manufacturing? Let's look at the alternatives of that era. Jeff Bezos had already founded Blue Origin in 2000. However, Bezos approached space from a classic, deliberate, highly risk-averse corporate timeline. Blue Origin operated in complete stealth mode for years, burning a small fraction of Amazon profits at a slow, incremental pace. Bezos wasn't willing to risk his core business or his entire personal net worth on rapid, dangerous iteration. Larry Page and Sergey Brin were building Google into the dominant search engine on the planet, preparing for their massive 2004 IPO. Their expertise and focus were entirely aligned with information architecture, software scalability, and data monetization, domains where margins were high and physical capital risk was practically zero. Peter Thiel, Musk's former co-founder at PayPal, recognized the exact same cultural stagnation. But Thiel chose the path of financial capital deployment, founding Palantir and Founders Fund to invest in high-margin software systems rather than taking on the operational nightmare of building physical manufacturing plants. The reality was that almost every rational actor with liquidity in 2002 chose to stay on the software side of the fence. Software didn't explode on the launch pad. Software didn't require multi-billion-dollar automotive stamping presses, federal crash testing, environmental impact permits, or supply chains spanning 5 continents. Systemic voids exist in the economy all the time. The bottleneck to filling those voids is almost never a lack of ideas or a lack of engineering talent. The true bottleneck is an extreme, near irrational appetite for risk, the willingness to accept a high probability of total, public bankruptcy in exchange for a non-zero chance of fundamental industrial disruption. Yet, identifying a void and possessing the capital to attack it does not guarantee survival. In fact, between 2002 and 2008, the hypothesis that commercial rocketry and electric cars were unviable almost proved entirely correct. SpaceX's first rocket, the Falcon 1, failed on its first launch in 2006. It failed again on its second launch in 2007. And in mid-2008, the third launch failed once more, destroying the primary payload on board, which included operational satellites for NASA and the US military. By late 2008, SpaceX was down to its last few $1 million. Simultaneously, Tesla was bleeding money rapidly as the engineering costs for the original Roadster spiraled out of control, right as the global subprime mortgage crisis locked up credit markets worldwide. Musk was on the absolute brink of losing both companies and his entire personal fortune in a matter of weeks. And this is where mainstream biographical narratives often miss the most crucial structural detail. The very system that created the void ultimately intervened to save the disruptor. In September 2008, Falcon 1 finally achieved orbit on its fourth attempt, making it the first privately funded liquid-fueled rocket to reach space. Recognizing that their own internal shuttle program was nearing retirement and that relying entirely on Russian Soyuz rockets would be a geopolitical disaster, NASA made a radical institutional shift. In December 2008, in the absolute depths of the worst financial crisis since the Great Depression, NASA awarded SpaceX a $1.6 billion commercial resupply services contract. That contract did not just save SpaceX from immediate liquidation, it validated the entire commercial space industry model in the eyes of institutional investors. Shortly after, the U.S. Department of Energy granted Tesla a $465 million low-interest loan under the Advanced Technology Vehicles Manufacturing Program, providing the capital necessary to build out the Model S assembly line in Fremont, California. The ultimate takeaway of the 2002 to 2008 cycle is profound. Macroeconomic ecosystems create the systemic gaps. Extreme individual actors step in to take the initial, suicidal risks required to bridge those gaps. But once the concept is proven to be technically viable, the institutional ecosystem steps back in to fund, scale, and embed that disruption into the national infrastructure. If we step back from the specific story of Elon Musk and look at 2002 as a structural case study, we arrive at a formula: systemic institutional stagnation plus unconstrained high-risk capital plus a cultural narrative void equals industrial disruption. This realization forces us to stop asking the superficial question, who is the next Elon Musk? Instead, we must ask the analytical question, where are the massive structural voids of our current decade that legacy institutions are refusing to address? Look at the industrial landscape around us today. First, the artificial intelligence infrastructure void. We have hyper-advanced software models, yet our physical energy grid and data center hardware are completely unequipped to handle the immense power consumption required for next-generation compute. Second, the sovereign semiconductor manufacturing void. Advanced microchip fabrication is dangerously concentrated in a single geographical region, creating a single point of failure risk for the entire global economy that legacy political systems have struggled to reshore. Third, the next-generation energy deployment void. Nuclear energy technology has advanced significantly, yet regulatory paralysis and legacy utility monopolies keep clean, scalable baseload power locked behind decades of bureaucratic delays. History teaches us that large, profitable institutions rarely fix their own systemic flaws from the inside out. The gaps are always filled by outsiders who have enough capital to enter the arena and enough appetite for risk to gamble everything on a single outcome. Which of today's massive institutional voids will be the one to define the next 20 years? And more importantly, who will be reckless enough to jump in? That is the question we will continue to explore in this series. Subscribe, hit the notification bell, and leave your thoughts on today's systemic gaps in the comments below. See you in the next episode.